Today is August 7th, 2007. I am Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Dickinson, North Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
Louis Helfrich.
Okay. When and where were you born?
I was born March 7th, 1927, in Morton County, just south of Glenullen.
Have you ever heard an interesting story about your birth?
No, I can't say as I have.
Do you know, was a midwife or a doctor present?
There was a doctor that came out from Glenullen, O.T. Benson.
Can you share your earliest memory with us?
Oh, I would suspect probably, I remember as a youngster I broke my arm. I was about 3 or 4 years old. And my mother said we were horsing around, and my dad had built a small bench for us, and I got up on this thing and stood on the end of it and fell off and broke my arm. That's the first memory that I have. After that, I would say probably first grade, when I went to school. I went to school at country school, number 8. It's about 4 miles south of Glenullen. Schoolhouse still sits there.
Was it a one-room school?
It was a one-room school. And my teacher was a Mrs. Shantz, or Miss Shantz. Miss Shantz.
Did you like her?
Yes, I did. She was a very good teacher. And I remember, one incident. We walked to school. We had a mile and a half to walk to school, and my brother, just a year older than I am, were walking home together, and there was a culvert in the road, and we decided we were going to crawl through this thing. And about that time, my parents came home from town and caught us. We got a good lecture. Then the second grade, we moved then when I was in my second grade. We moved to a farm about 10 miles south of Glenullen. This was in November of 1933. My dad had homesteaded back in what we call the hills, and decided he just couldn't make it, so he sold everything he had and had $20 left after the auction sale. And we moved on to another farm and rented that for 7 years. That was a rather traumatic time for me in grade school because, I'd learned to read and et cetera in the first grade, and then we moved, shortly after my second year in grade school. And we moved into Grant County, and their schools were wanting, I guess is the best word I can use. In the 30s, there wasn't any money to pay them, so they paid them in warrants, and then they couldn't cash the warrants, and after a month or two, the teacher would leave, and then we'd get another one. And so I didn't do real well in my second grade. In December of that same year, 1933, the old Germans had a policy where they celebrated names days, and my dad's name was John, and that names day was on the 27th of December. And I can remember my younger brother John being quite ill at the time, although we didn't know it. You know, we had all these people at the house. A day later, they got a doctor and they found out he had scarlet fever. So we were quarantined, and I was out of school for about 6 weeks, and then went back to school, and I had to repeat the second grade the following year then. That was a traumatic year for me. And then after the second grade, we went to the same country school, and I'm not sure that, I think it was that year or my fourth grade that we had 4 or 5 different teachers. Because they just come and work for a month or so and didn't get paid, so they left. And I was in the 5th grade when we started the country school, and then brother Leo, that was a year older than I was, went to the parochial school in Glenallen because we made our first Holy Communion. And we went to the parochial school starting after Christmas until the school year ended.
And how is that different from?
Well, the parochial school was quite a bit different than our one-room country school, because there were a lot of kids going to school, and we were country kids, and they seemed to pick on us, and we'd get into the little scrapes now and then. By the end of the school year, we were pretty good buddies, most of us. But, from there on, then we went back out to the country school, and I went to that country school through the 7th grade. We went back to the country school, and as I said, I went there until the 7th grade when my dad bought a farm 5 miles south and a mile west of Glenallen. And this was a farm that meant a great deal to him, because as a youth he spent a great deal of time on this farm. And I finished country school, 8th grade, in a one-room country schoolhouse. Had a terrific teacher, and she taught all year, which was different. And that was in the fall of 1940. And then after my 8th grade, I spent, my dad was sick that year, so I spent 1 year between my 8th grade and high school. I spent 1 year on the farm, putting in the crop and all those sort of things. And then my dad got quite a bit better and, could handle the farm again. And we were only out 6 miles, and I rode horseback to high school. 6 miles in and 6 miles out every day. For the next 3 years. I did stay in town, probably January and February, a couple of months at the most.
Who did you stay with?
I stayed 1 year with my dad's sister, my aunt, and then 2 years, I should say, I stayed with my sister, my dead sister and aunt. And then the third year, I stayed with a family that lived in town that we knew from. They used to live out in our neighborhood, and they bought a house in town, and I stayed with them. My fourth year, my younger sister started high school. And we had an old Model A Ford that we drove to high school when I was a senior. After I was a senior, I stayed home for another year. And then there was a job opening in Glenullen at the Curlow Elevator and Lumber Company, and I was hired as their bookkeeper. And I worked there for a couple of years and got married and moved to Dickinson. So that pretty much covers, my growing up, you're right.
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about your family?
Well, my dad was born in Karlsruhe, Russia. And his father had served his time in the Russian army. And after he got out of service, there wasn't any land left. They couldn't buy any land. And there wasn't any land left for him to start farming on. And he had saved up enough money while he was in the service so that he could come to the United States. So he came with my grandmother, and my dad was 6 months old when they got to Richardson, North Dakota. And my grandfather was helping a neighbor clean out his well and was gassed. They lived in the United States 6 weeks. And of course, my grandmother was destitute, to be honest, because they'd spend all the money for fare to come to this country. And she really wanted to go back, but she had no relatives here and no money to get back. Well, then my grandfather was gassed in July, and then through need, my grandmother married again in November that same year. And, my father didn't get along too well with his stepfather. So he spent a large time or a great deal of time with this neighbor by the name of McGrath, the farm that my dad eventually bought in 1940. And he was really a mentor to my father.
What was your father's name?
John. My mother's family came, I think, about 4 or 5 years later than my dad did. And my mother was born south of Glenullen in the St. Joe community. And her name was Catherine Michael. And her family was, they were teachers. Although her father started to farm in the United States, but her grandfather continued to teach at his home. And that's where my father met her, in this country school that my great-grandfather started. My mother was born in 1897. My dad was born in 1892. And and I think it was in 1913. My dad homesteaded 3 miles south and a mile and a half east of Glenullen, back what we call the hill country. And that's where he and my mother lived, in a sod house. They got married in 1915, and they had their 2 older children were born in that sod house. And then he bought another quarter of land that laid next to his homestead, which had a house on it. And that's where all my siblings except our youngest Jim they were all born on that farm. And as I indicated early on in 1933, things didn't look so hot, so my dad sold the land and whatever else. He kept the machinery and the livestock and moved on to a farm.
Right. Can you tell me what your relationship with your father was like?
I had a good relationship with my father. Yeah.
Was he a really emotional
Yes, he was.
person?
Yeah. Very soft, very emotional. Mm-hmm. Yes, he was.
What else can you tell me about your father? What kind of person he was?
Well, he was about 6 foot tall, skinny all his life. I don't think he ever weighed over 160 pounds. And he was a hard worker, you know. I mean, we learned to work when we were young. But he was a really good father. He was very strict. I mean, there wasn't any... I remember getting spanked once.
What did you do to deserve that?
Well, my older brother was in the mow of the barn, and it was a windy day, and I went up to see him. And as I came out, when I went in, the door was open, the bottom, and my dad was in the tool shed when I came out, and my brother hollered down to me to close the door. I said, it was open when I came in. You come down and close it. You know, and my dad heard me, and I got spanked. It's the only time I ever got spanked by my dad.
Was your dad the primary disciplinarian in your family?
No, I wouldn't say the primary. Not really. I think Mother was probably the primary disciplinarian at our house.
And how did you usually get punished?
How did I usually get punished? Well, usually I had to kneel in the corner someplace, you know.
Can you tell me what kind of person your mom was?
Yes, my mother was she was not as easygoing as my dad was. She was a very good mother, though. You know, she's a great cook. as all of the old Germans were, I guess. You know. But she pretty much run the household, you know. When it came time to, going to church or things like that, she was the gal that motivated us and got us to go to church on Sundays. But we played a lot of games, you know, when we were kids growing up with our parents.
What kinds of games?
Well, mostly card games, but we also had checker games, American checkers and Chinese checkers, and mostly whist is what we played a lot of. So in the wintertime. During the summer time, we didn't have time for that, but in the wintertime, why? We played quite a bit of whist. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell me about your parents?
Well, I always felt pretty lucky to have good parents like I did, to be honest about it. My dad lived to be 85, and my mother was just a month short of 90. And, they were good parents. They were good citizens. One of the things about my parents was that they made sure that we all knew we were Americans. I know after the First World War, there was a lot of tension between the Germans from Russia and Germans in particular. And they made doggone sure that we all knew we were Americans. We weren't Germans from Russia, just didn't cut the mustard, I guess. I don't know.
So did you speak German at home?
We never spoke German. My mother, coming from a teaching background, made sure that all of us knew our ABCs and could count and all those sort of things. We couldn't read when we started school, but she saw to it that we all had a start, and we always spoke English. I can remember my parents speaking German to each other occasionally, and I understood most of it. But I couldn't hold a conversation or anything like that. It wasn't until I started work for the Corolla Elevator Company at Glenallen that one of the fellas, one day some fella came in and asked for a Schraubenzieher. Well, I didn't know what in the world he was talking about. And this fellow was so incensed that, he went to my boss and said I couldn't understand German. And my boss came and said, "You come from a German family and you don't understand German." And I said, "That's correct." And he said, "Well, starting right now, we're going to start German lessons. I'm going to talk German to you, and you're going to have to answer me in German." And that's where I really got to know how to speak German. Not well, but enough to get by on then. But since then, I've lost it all again.
All right. Anything else about your parents?
Oh gosh, I don't really know if,
How many children did they have?
They had 11 children.
Can you name them all in birth order?
Yes, well, just about. My older sister Eva lives in Dickinson. And then there's Pete, he lives in Billings. George lives in Chicago. Tom lives in Eugene, Oregon. And then there were two sisters that died. They were 3 and 4 years old, Pauline and Josephine. And I don't know which one of those was older or not. And then there was the spread, and then my brother Leo, and then myself, and then my sister Alice, my brother John, and the baby was Jim. Now the two younger girls, they were 3 and 4 years old, died of pneumonia. That was the year my grandmother, my mother's mother, passed away. And within 6 weeks, the two girls passed away too. So there was, my dad always said he had two families, you know, the older 4 and then the younger bunch. By the time my youngest brother Jim was born, my older sister and my two older brothers had left home. And she never had all of her children together at one time until after the Second World War, when they came home from service and we all met. It was the only time that was the first time she ever had all her family together. And the second time was on their 50th wedding anniversary.
Growing up, which one of your siblings were you closest to?
Well, I was, as a young kid, I was close to Leo. He was just a year and a month older than I was. But he had some physical and mental illness, you know. He was hurt when he was born, is what happened. And, you know, and then after that, you know, I was very close to my sister Alice and my brother John. And we still get together they both live in North Dakota, and we get together at least once a quarter and we have dinner or something.
Do you know any interesting stories about the births of any of your siblings?
No, I really don't.
Okay. All right. Did you all get along well growing up?
We got along as well as any kids did, you know. My brother that was a year older than I, we used to get in arguments, you know, like I think all kids do. And it wasn't until after I discovered that he was, you know, ill that, you know, that changed. And then, of course, my brother John was quite a bit younger than I am. And, you know, as a kid, he used to get on my nerves because I was anxious to get things done, and he wasn't, you know. So
Different personalities.
right. Mm-hmm.
What kinds of mischief did you and your brothers and sisters?
Oh, we never got into any mischief. Well, oh, I don't know. I suppose one of the things I could relate to, my older brother was home one time and we had slingshots, homemade slingshots, and we were out sitting on the sill of the barn door, and our windmill was probably 50 feet, 60 feet from, and the chickens were drinking water, and he said, "I bet you can't hit one of those chickens," and I up and hit one of the chickens and killed it, and he said, "Well, you better get rid of that before your mother sees it."
Did you get caught?
Nope. I did tell my mother years later, and she said, "Well, it's a good thing you did, because you'd have sure got a spanking that time."
Do you remember anything else about?
Well, one of the things we used to do when we were kids was we did a lot of sledding in the wintertime. And we had an ideal place to sled. We had a hill about a quarter of a mile from home, and we had a big creek that went down past this hill. And my dad had built a bobsled. You know what a bobsled is. And we would take a horse out to drag the sled back up the hill. Then one of us would ride down and the other one go down on the sled. But we come down this hill and there was a creek down below that made a bend just as we got pretty close to running out of gas. And the sled would drop down on the ice, and then we'd scoot down on the ice for quite a ways, you know. But that was one of our pastimes. Did we ever get into trouble doing that? I don't know that we ever told our folks about it, you know.
And what other pastimes did you and your siblings have?
Well, we did a lot of reading, you know. Especially in the wintertime, not so much in the summertime, because summertimes we'd work in the fields until we were dog tired, and we'd come home and jump in the creek and rinse off and have some supper and go to bed. But in the wintertime, we played a lot of games, and of course we worked doing chores in the morning, you know, and the afternoons while we were short.
What kinds of books did you read?
Well, I used to get books from the state library at Bismarck. They had a program where you could, if you signed up, you could get 3, 4 books at a time. And then when you were through reading those, then you would send them back and they'd send 3, 4 more. But most of them were, adventure stories, I'd call them. They were hunting and, you know, old Jack London stories and things of that nature. But we did develop a good habit of reading that I still do today.
It sounds like education was very important in your family.
It was. It was. Yeah. There were just my 2 older brothers that did not go to high school. My older brother ended up being a vice president of the bank in Billings. And my second brother that didn't go to high school went to Coyne Electric College in Chicago, and he became maintenance foreman for Argo Starch. So, you know. And my third brother, the oldest, was a pharmacist. Now, I did not have a college education. My older sister went to high school, but she managed Buttress Clothing Store in Dickinson for many years. And then my sister Alice was a school teacher. And my two younger brothers, John and Jim, were farmers. And I ended up in Dickinson. I did take a accounting course from Ford Motor Company. After I moved to Dickinson, I worked for Turner Incorporated, which was a construction company. But Shorty Turner passed away in about a year, and then I went to work for the Ford dealer as a business manager, and I took an accounting course through Ford Motor Company. And then they burnt down in 1958, February 1958. And I had an opportunity to go to Great Falls and work for Ford Motor Company at that time, but we were raising our family. We just bought a house, and there was an opening at Mann's Automotive as business manager, so I took that and spent the next 30 years at Mann's Automotive. I retired in 1989. I was manager of the store for the last 5 years that I was there. But life's been good.
We're going to change topics a little bit here. Can you
Okay.
tell me about the chores you needed to do as a child when you were growing up?
Oh, sure. Well, the first thing I can remember, of course, is hauling water. I think every kid had to do that. We didn't have any running water. We didn't have electricity, on the farm. And the well water that we used for our livestock was brown water, so we had to haul water out of the creek to do the washing with once a week. And then we had a shallow well that we could use for drinking water and, baths and things of that nature. But, that's the first thing I can remember. And I remember, we had other chores. My older sister is just about 11 years older than I am, and my younger sister is 4 years younger than I am. So, around the house, we helped my mother. We as much as we could, although I was the primary worker outdoors too, because my older brothers were gone, and by the time I was 11 years old, they were all gone. So, I did a lot of work out in the fields and things of that nature. I remember raking hay, for an example. I must have been about 9, 10 years old. I was on a hay rack, or a hay gathering machine, and my dad was cutting hay, in the same area, so that I wasn't alone. But when I was 10 years old or 11 years old, I was cultivating corn and raking hay and hauling hay, milking cows, cleaning the barns. I can remember that was a chore when I was probably 4th or 5th grade somewhere. We had the country school we went to, but we had to clean the barn before we went to school every morning. So we'd clean the doggone barn and then go in and change clothes and then go to school and come home. And I think school let out about 3:30 if I remember right. we'd come home and have a peanut butter and syrup sandwich or something like that. And then back out the yard and, bring in the cows and feed the chickens and all of that sort of thing. In the spring of the year, my dad would be out in the field, so, we got to milk all the cows. And we did have two different herds of cattle. We had what we call the range cattle. Those were Hereford cattle, and then we had another herd that were Holsteins that we milked. And we milked up to 20 cows. And my brother and my sister and myself and my mother used to do the milking, in the spring and the fall of the year. The one job on the farm that I detested was milking.
Why did you hate it so much?
Mostly because it tied me down for weekends. You could never leave because the milking had to be done. But it was good income, it was what kept us going in those tough years. That and the fact that my dad mined coal and sold it to the church and the parochial schools, and even sold, one winter sold coal to the plant over at Richardson at the Abbey.
You mentioned helping your mom inside.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things did you help her with?
Oh, I used to scrub the floor. I used to help her bake, and cook. Which I still love to do today. Not scrubbing floors, but I mean baking. Yeah.
Well, what kinds of things did she bake?
Oh man, she baked. Well, every weekend she would bake a cake of some sort, and then pies. And cookies we had all the time. Those were just standard at our house. She baked bread, I remember as a kid taking a little coaster wagon to go out in the pasture and pick up cow chips. Bring them home, and she loved the cow chips to bake bread because it was a quick, hot fire, and it lasted so long it was over with. And she also used cow chips and corn cobs to heat the stove to do her ironing. Flat irons, like those on the hearth there.
Did you have to help with laundry?
Yes. That's another thing that I remember now that you mentioned. Laundry. When I was 1936. I was 9 years old before my mother got a power washer, gasoline powered. Up until that time, she had a wooden washer that, had a handle on it, and my brother Leo and myself would end up on the end of that handle, and we did a lot of that. But she was fortunate because she had a wringer on it and could, run the clothes through a wringer. And yeah, I helped with laundry. Mm-hmm. My mother used to make her own soap too.
Remember how she made it?
I don't really remember how. I know that she used lye and pork rinds, I think. I just, but other than that, I don't remember.
Remember, did you ever get sent to work for a neighbor or a relative?
In the summertime, during the 40s, we had tremendous crops. And it was during the war, and help was hard to get. And my brother Leo and I would shock, for our neighbors. And I remember we shocked for $1 an acre. And he was a good neighbor. He made sure that we got paid in $1 bills, and then he'd come with a wad of money and count them out, and there were no 20s or 10s. It was all $1 bills. Other than that, we never worked for neighbors. Later on we thrashed, as well. My dad and my uncle had a thrashing machine rig, and they'd start in the fall and way into November sometimes before they get done.
They go around to neighbors' places?
Yeah. They covered a large area. We lived south of Glenullen, they'd go north of Glenullen 7-8 miles, and then they'd go south of Glenullen about 7-8 miles or 10 miles, so. But my dad was gone from, the middle of August to the 1st of October threshing. I remember one year we planted sugar cane, and it grew 7-8 feet tall, and I was just a little guy at the time. And my dad took off time to binder it, and then my mother and Leo and myself had to shock it. And these darn bundles were so darn tall, when you get around them, why they'd, try to keep them upright was a chore, but we managed.
Do you remember anything else about chores or work on the farm?
Well, what chores do we do on the farm? We'd milk the cows and clean the barns and, haul water.
Were chores different in the summer than in the winter?
Oh, yes. Oh, sure, they were different. In the wintertime, after I got to be about 11, 12 years old, I'd help feed the cattle, because we had range cattle, and we'd have to feed those. And then we did everything with horses. In the summertime, we didn't have to feed the cattle, we just run them out on the range. I can remember in 1934, 35, probably 36, somewhere in there. I think it was 1934. There was a good crop stand, and we went to church on a Sunday morning, and the wind came up, and it was hot. And we came home, and we had enough horses so that my dad said, we're going to hook up the binder and we're going to cut her down. So they had 2 sessions a day. They'd run one 4-horse team and then another 4-horse team. And we cut it all down and thrashed it. We didn't get much grain out of it, but we got one heck of a big straw pile. And our neighbors, said, why go through all that, just for a little grain? Dad said, well, we need straw anyway. So we had this huge straw pile, and then in 1935 and 36 there was less, and we were selling the straw for $1 a load. So it was a good investment after all. We didn't know it at the time, of course, but
Now that would have been during the Dirty 30s.
that was the dirty 30s, is right.
Can you tell me anything else that you remember about that time?
About the dirty 30s, yeah, I can tell you about the grasshoppers coming. We had grasshoppers that, would block out the sun. And they came in swarms, and they would eat up everything overnight. The next day they'd move on somewhere else. I remember in I forget what year, 38, maybe 39, we used to harvest with a binder and a header. You know what a header was, but anyway, one of the horses broke a martingale on the harness, and my dad took it and hung it on a fence post and let it there overnight. Next morning, he'd forgot it that night. The next morning, he went to pick it up, and it was full of holes. The grasshoppers had eaten up that martingale. My mother used to bring lunch out to us in the middle of the day, sandwiches and, peaches or something. And she used a baking dish, I don't know, not a baking dish. Anyway, it was a round dish about 18 inches in diameter, something like that, and she'd use a cloth over the top of it, to keep it clean and bugs out of it and things. And she brought it out one day and laid it to the side, and we had our lunch, and by the time she wanted to put it back on, it was full of holes. The grasshoppers had just devoured that thing, and you couldn't walk if in the shade. It was so full of grasshoppers that it was just unreal. We used to spread arsenic. I know it was an arsenic mixed with sawdust, which was dangerous, but it was.
Poison them?
Yep.
You were telling us about the Dirty 30s.
Mm-hmm.
What else do you remember about that time?
Well, I can remember the winds that we had, and the farm we lived on, the soil was very sandy. And of course, Russian thistles is the only thing that grew in those years. And they would pile up against the fence. And then the wind would blow the sand and cover the fences. So I remember as a kid going out with my older brothers and my dad, and some places we'd dig it out, and some places we would just build over the top of the sand to keep the cattle from walking out. And then the other thing was that, the wind used to come up and, without any warning or anything. We didn't have the modern weather forecasting that we do today. And I can remember that the wind would come up and my mother would call us, to come on in, the wind's coming up, it's going to blow again. And we'd go in the house, and although we had a pretty good house, we didn't, there was dust all over, but, it didn't blow in one end and out the other like some of them did. I don't know.
Remember the WPA?
I sure do. I sure do. I was going to say my dad worked on it. He did not work for the WPA. He worked for a construction company that built Highway 49 in 1936. He worked, there wasn't any crop to harvest or anything, and he worked for about 6 weeks, I guess, and then it was so dusty and, that he ended up getting pneumonia and was sick for a couple of months again. But the WPA, I remember, they built a dam for our neighbors, which was a godsend because we go skating and things like that over there. And they also built, as you know, a lot of municipal buildings. They put up a city auditorium at Glenallen. They put in the waterworks at Glenallen. They didn't have any running water in that city until WPA came along. And I remember them building a road south of Glenallen. I remember the WPAs. I had at least one uncle that worked on WPA. Other than that, I don't know. There could have been two, but I'm not aware of that. Which was a good program, actually.
How about the CCCs?
My second brother, George, joined the CCs in 1930, fall of 36, I think it was, or 39, 36. And he was stationed in Montana, and he was with a road building crew. And I forget how much money they got a month anymore, but I think it was $18 a month that was sent home. I think they got $25 a month, and I think 18 was sent home. The rest was their money. And that was when my mother got her washing machine, her gas-powered washing machine.
Is there anything else you remember about the Depression?
Well, I can remember we were poor like everyone else. The thing that kept us from going on relief, like a lot of the farmers in our area did, was the fact that my dad mined coal, and we did enough milking and had enough chickens to, buy groceries and clothing with. And of course, those days it didn't take a whole ton of money to survive on the farm. My mother did a lot of the sewing,
Did you get any clothes from the store?
No, from the store. Oh yes, oh yes. Like overalls. But some of the shirts she made. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Shoes, of course, socks.
How many pairs of shoes did you get in a year?
In a year, probably one. And I used them for working in the yard and the farm on weekdays, and on Sunday mornings my dad had a can of used oil. We would dab them up with oil and wear them to church.
Anything else about the Depression before we leave this topic?
Oh, I don't know. Gasoline, of course, was cheap. My dad would fill the car. I think he got 5 gallons for $1. And that would last for quite a while.
Do you remember getting the first car in your family?
No, I don't. That was bought in 1926, year before I was born.
Okay.
Yep. We drove it for 10 years.
All right then. We'll change topics again.
All right.
Can you tell me about the house you grew up in, or the houses?
The houses I grew up in. Well, the first house was a small house. It had 2 bedrooms on the main floor, a kitchen and a living room, dining room area, and a large bedroom on the second floor. I don't remember too much of that house. I left there when I was 6 years old. And then the second house that I really remember was it was a reasonably new house. And it was quite a bit bigger. It had 2 bedrooms on the main floor, a living room and dining room and a kitchen, and then 2 bedrooms on the second floor. And it had hardwood floors, I remember. That's one of the chores I had to do when I was helping my mother, was to mop that floor every week.
Now, how were the sleeping arrangements?
Well, my older sister and my youngest sister, they're quite a spread between ages, but they had the 1 bedroom downstairs, and all the boys slept in the bedroom upstairs, or the 2 bedrooms upstairs. And, you know, although there were 9 of us living, there was 2 of the older boys were gone. And then the third one left he graduated in 1939 and left the farm. So, you know, after that it was just the 4 boys and my sister that were home yet. So, you know, we didn't have any sleeping problems. And then the farm that my dad bought is a farm that he was familiar with, and it was called the McGrath Farm. And this man took him under his wing, and when it came up for sale in fall of 1940, he bought it. And that had a big house on it. It had, 2 bedrooms downstairs and 2 upstairs, and a dining room and a living room. Huge kitchen. But it was really run down when he bought it, and it was kind of hard to move from a nice house into a one that was rather shabby. And we lived in it for one year, or maybe 2 at the most, and my dad was a pretty handy carpenter, so he remodeled it, brought it back to what it was as he remembered it. And that's the only house that is still setting. It's in pretty tough shape, I understand. I haven't seen it for years, but it's been vacant for 25 years, I guess, something like that.
Right. Growing up, how often did your family entertain guests at their home?
Oh, quite often. Quite often. They did a lot of card playing with the neighbors. You know, this would be in the wintertime. In the summertime, everybody, was busy. But in the wintertime, I know that the one family they'd play with once a week. And then, there were other families. They entertained quite a bit, to be honest. My mother had a names day, my dad had a names day, and, birthdays and things of that nature.
And how did you celebrate names days?
Well, names days, my dad's was on the 27th of December, that's St. John's, and my mother's was the 25th of November, which is St. Catherine's. But, Dad would usually, this was in the days when, when I remember later on, of course, it was legal, but, in days of Prohibition, why, But I remember him making a little whiskey, I guess, I don't know.
Do you remember how he made it?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell me how?
Yeah. He'd get a bottle of alcohol at the drugstore, and then he would take sugar, and he had a big pan, and he would they'd actually burn the sugar somehow. Don't ask me how. I just remember watching him do it. And it had to get to a certain brown color before it was satisfactory. And then he would run that sugar or run that alcohol and water, I think, I forget if he used water or not, through the sugar. And, he'd usually end up with one bottle, And then when they played cards, why, everybody got 2 shots of whiskey. They got one before they started, and they got one before they had their lunch at the end of the evening. And they always had a huge lunch, sandwiches and cakes and, everybody played cards. Yeah.
How about birthdays? How did you celebrate those?
Birthdays were, we always had a cake. Mother always made a cake for us, with candles, of course. But we didn't have any outside guests at our birthdays. It was just a family.
How did you celebrate holidays growing up?
Holidays.
Like Christmas.
Say Christmas. Okay. Well, Christmas was a big event at our house. Mother would, of course, bake and, make cookies and candies and for a month ahead of time. And we always had a Christmas tree. I don't ever remember not having a Christmas tree at our house. Even in the 30s when, things were tough, we did have a Christmas tree. And on the tree, we didn't have electricity, so she used wax candles within a little holder. And decorating the tree was always a big affair. It was a Sunday afternoon, and everybody took part in it. Of course, Mother was the final say on how it was decorated. And then those candles were lit on Christmas Eve. And then we'd stand around and we would sing for a couple of songs because those candles didn't last very long, and we'd have to blow them out. My mother's family was very, very musical. My great-grandfather was a liturgical music instructor in Russia. And it just was handed down to all of the family after that. They all sang and played some instrument, or instruments, I should say. So, at Christmas time, we always sang. When we were doing dishes, we would sing. Or if we'd be driving to town to go to church, we'd sing. We'd sing on the way home from church. I mean, it was just a part of the family,
What songs would you sing?
A lot of them were, at Christmas time we sang Christmas songs. But other than that, we sang a lot of the old German songs. I can't sing them anymore, but at one time I could. And then Christmas, after the Christmas tree was lit, we'd sing the songs. Then we'd open our Christmas gifts. Because we always went to midnight mass. So we'd open our gifts, and by that time we'd be ready to drive to town to go to midnight mass.
What kinds of things did you get for gifts?
As a child, well, during the 30s, not much. I remember one year, my brother Leo and I, we got little bitty trucks, I remember one year getting a set of American checkers, games. We got quite a few games. Later on, we got Monopoly and all those sort of things,
What else do you remember about Christmas?
Well, after midnight mass, we would come home, and we always had a lunch after we got home from midnight mass. Ham sandwiches. I don't know why, except that we had a lot of ham, I guess. And then, of course, we'd get up in the morning and we'd do chores. We had to do the chores. We had to milk the cows and feed the cattle and things. And during the day, we'd play games, and that was about it.
Did you celebrate with extended family?
Not so much when I was a child, but after we got married, then we spent a lot of time. Our families got together, yes. Mm-hmm. On Christmas Day, and Mother always had a huge dinner,
And what was Christmas dinner?
Well, it depended on, sometimes it was a turkey and a goose, or most of the time it was a turkey and a goose. With all the trimmings, sweet potatoes and mashed potatoes and carrots and all that kind of stuff. Dressings, pies, cakes. It was enough to eat.
All right. Well, what do you remember about other holidays, like Easter?
Well, the other thing I was going to tell you about Christmas holidays was after Prohibition, you could buy the liquor again. But I can remember that my dad, on names days and birthdays and Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, everybody got a little glass. When we were kids, we got a little glass of wine, and he would have his shot of whiskey. So, every Christmas and Easter and so forth, we we always looked forward to that. Get that little glass of wine. Now, what was the other question?
Just wondering about other holidays.
Oh, well, Thanksgiving was a big holiday too. You know, and we celebrated. You know, there weren't any gifts or anything, but you know, Mother always made a big dinner.
Did you celebrate with just your family, or did you have people over?
Oh, we celebrated with our family, pretty much. Holidays were pretty much with our own family. You know, after we were married, we would go down and spend the day. There weren't too many of us around anymore, but you know, whoever was around would go down and spend the day. Easter was, one of the things I can remember about Easter. We didn't eat any candy during Lent, and in those days, the stores that we bought the groceries at would put in a little bag of candy, hard candy. They'd give away with every order, you know. Well, that was all saved until Holy Saturday afternoon, and then we could have candy again. And Mother would make, you know, Easter bread and sugar, what do they call it in German? It's a Kuchen anyway, it's sugar Kuchen or something like that. They always make those things. And then Lent was over at noon on Saturdays, and we would have our ham. And of course we always dyed eggs, you know.
And how did you dye them?
We dyed them just, you know, boil a bunch of them and dye them, you know, just tried to, we used, matter of fact, I did some this year. I thought I'd try it again, but we take the dyes and put them into cups with a little water, and then, you know, dye some solid, and then put a little oil in, you know, and then you get them marbleized, and, you know, some of them we'd write a name on and things like that.
And what did you do with the dyed eggs?
We kept them for probably a week or so, and then my mother would make potato salad with them, or egg salad, you know, salad for sandwiches or things like that. We never threw them out.
Do you remember anything else about Easter?
No, except that we'd go to Easter Mass every Monday or every Sunday or Easter Sunday. But other than that, I don't remember anything special.
Okay. Well then, how about the 4th of July?
Well, the 4th of July's were big celebrations. I remember years ago when I was a small child, some farmer would take it on to have a celebration at his farm. And the adults would play baseball and play cards. Kids would run around and play games. I remember one for the 4th of July. I'm not sure if it was a 4th of July celebration or a city anniversary or what it was, but the city had a program, and I remember that was the first time my dad bought me an ice cream cone. I must have been about 6 or 7 years old, something like that, I would say. I never had anything so good in my life.
Did your family ever make ice cream?
Yes, we did. Yeah. I remember we used to make it with we had a 5-gallon pail. And we had a gallon syrup can, if you know what that was. We used to buy syrup in a gallon can. And those cans were used for everything, our lunch buckets and, all those sort of things. And mother would mix up the ice cream and put it in this gallon pail, and we would sit with that 5-gallon pail, and we would move that bucket around inside and throw some salt on it every once in a while to keep the ice, So that's the way we made our ice cream. Our neighbors had an ice cream maker, with a handle on it you could turn, but we never had one of those. Well, I guess they did too after I left, but not while I was home.
Alright. Do you remember anything else about celebrations or holidays when you were growing up?
I really don't recall anything. Probably remember after you leave, but
Alright. Did your family ever take part in things like sausage parties?
well, we did not sausage parties, but we had butchering parties, or they weren't parties. They were, we'd have about. There was usually about 4 neighbors that would get together at one farm, and they would butcher hogs. And then they'd go to another farm, 2 or 3 days later until they made the rounds in the fall. And that was a big day because we didn't have any running water, no electricity, and we always butchered a lot of hogs. And we'd have to heat the water on the cook stove and then haul it down to the garage where we scraped the hogs. We didn't skin them because my dad figured that was a waste. But we would always scrape all the hair off and get it cleaned up. And then, of course, some of us sat on a grinder until our arms got sore. We had to grind it by hand to make the sausage, and we made a lot of sausage.
Do you remember how you made it?
Well, I know it was made in the wash tub. I can't tell you what the ingredients were. I could give you a little side story, though.
Alright.
Years ago, after a friend of mine, we used to go deer hunting all the time, we decided we were going to make some deer sausage. And we didn't want it fat, so we took all the fat off. And we made sausage, and we took it down. We borrowed a stuffer and a grinder, and we took it down and had it smoked. And when it was done, the sausage was about the size of my finger, and it was so hard that you could use it as a hammer. But, we didn't put any fat or anything in it. And anyway, that's a side story. Anyway, we learned quickly that you had to have some fat in there, which we did later on. But the butchering at home, after it was ground, my dad never mixed sausage, but we had a neighbor that mixed the sausage, and my dad cut the meat. He was pretty fussy about the pork chops and the hams, and he cut up the meat, and our neighbor mixed it up. And I can remember that they would, after he had it mixed, what he thought was right, well, then they would take a little out and then fry it to see how it tasted, and then stuffed it. And of course, because there wasn't any refrigeration, we had a lot of meat that had to be either canned or cured. And I know my mother canned a whole lot of it, but we also had 2 wooden barrels. There were 50-gallon barrels that we would put in the ham hocks and ribs and, things like that. And the hams. They were also cured before they were smoked. And then we would use that meat out of those barrels during the winter time because, as soon as it got warm, why, it would spoil on. Now the ham and the sausages were all smoked, and they would last into the summer, But we made blood sausage, we made liver sausage, we made, no, what the heck they call it anymore. But
To make head cheese?
head cheese, that's the word I was looking for, right.
Do you remember how you made that?
The head cheese? Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, the head cheese was made to use the stomach. Yep, they used the stomach and they would turn it inside out and then scrape it all clean and then wash it down in, I think it was lye water, if I'm not mistaken. And then they would use the jowls of the head and, things of that nature to make this head cheese. And I didn't care for it as a kid, but later on it was pretty good. They'd stuff that into the stomach, they'd turn it right side out again. But I don't know if that was smoked or not. I don't believe that was ever smoked. I don't remember it anyway. But the pork sausage and the liver sausage and blood sausage weren't smoked either. It was just the pork sausage that was smoked. Mm-hmm.
How about butchering chickens or beef?
Chickens, we had a lot of chicken during the summer, My mother always got 100 chickens, I think, or 150 or whatever. And she'd get them early enough in the year so that by the 4th of July we could have spring chicken. And we ate a lot of chicken in the summertime. And then come harvest time, why, we'd have little pigs, that we would butcher, and we'd have fresh pork. In the fall of the year, sometime before we did the butchering, we always butchered a beef also. And that was, a lot of that was canned, except for, the stuff that we could hang up that would, it was cold enough so it wouldn't spoil,
Okay. Do you remember anything else about butchering?
Well, I can remember that the ladies got together at everybody's house and, they did all the cooking and I know frying out the fat for lard, that was usually at the end of the day. And I can remember that awful smell that we had in the house for a day or two. But they'd cook and they made, I don't know what they called them, but they had to have fresh pork fat to make it was some kind of a dessert. We called them snowballs. I don't know what, they were not balls, but, and they were delicious. But, Now, those were always kind of, they were tough days, we worked hard. But, everybody was joking and had a good time. I mean, it was a good get together for the neighbors.